We survived the first week of classes in the Grand Canyon. Thus far, I haven't had anyone ask me, but they will. They do as much as sometimes. I always take my shoes off before I start class. And usually eventually somebody asks, first they just see it as an eccentric old man, I suppose, with sore feet, which isn't true. No. Some of it isn't true. My feet aren't sore. Other than that, I'm supposed to cut it on. But when somebody eventually asks why I take my shoes off, I tell them because this is holy ground. And it is. The same reason I take them off in here is our time together is holy ground. It's an opportunity when our hearts and minds are being directed to God. We have one more Sunday and we're through James. Keith has a yes. We're through James last time, which was 2 weeks ago today. Joint service was last week. But last time, as we started into chapter 4 of James, and today we finished chapter 4 of James, and next week chapter 5. The heading overall for those three that the Lord gave me, and I must confess this time through James, the Lord has approached it from a little different angle than any time I've gone through James before. But it was boot camp and beyond, leaving the undisciplined life behind. And I think that that's probably an important reminder to all of us, certainly to me, kind of thing. And if you recall, 2 weeks ago, we talked about marching orders, in James 4, 7, and 8, which we'll sort of start with that here in a moment today. Today, the heading that God had given to me was deployment. And if you can see there, deployment, get your act together and take it on the Calvary Road. One of the things when God gives me a series and gives me the titles for the different things is a lot of the time I don't really realize more fully why he's saying specific things through me, at least in advance, until we actually get there. And this was an interesting one like that. Deployment, of course. What do we mean by deployment? What does deployment mean when we think of it? What applications do we usually think of when we hear about someone being deployed?
Sending out troops.
Yeah, sending out the troops, oftentimes for battle. Sending them out into a field, sending them out many times into other countries, or deploying your assets. Sending people out doesn't have to always be war, but it's always sending them out for a purpose and under authority. Sort of thing. You're being deployed by some authority, or someone, or some organization, or whatever it may be. And certainly God wants us to hold in mind, humbly hold in mind, as we'll do this morning, that we are being deployed. It's not simply a matter of when we are saved, then we can sit back and do the just and outlining and pursue whatever we think will increase our self-righteousness or whatever else. And if we read in the scriptures too, Old Testament and New, usually when God deploys people, he deploys them beyond their own strength and wisdom into situations where their own strength and wisdom would not be enough in a lot of ways. And that we move, as we talked about in Sunday school for conversations again this morning, by faith, walking by faith, not by sight, and earnestly seeking what God wants to say. The imageries that came to mind on this as a contrast, very interesting, about deployment or being sent out. How many of you have ever followed, or I'm sure you've seen and heard about, or even participated in the, what is it they call it, the Great Arizona Duck Race? Yeah, at least once a year for some charity or another, but you can win all kinds of things, I think. You can make a contribution, and you get a little yellow ducks, you know, like a rubber ducky for the bathtub, a little rubber ducky, and there's a number on it, and that's your number, the ticket you bought or the donation you made. And they end up with 15 or 20,000 of these ducks donated, and depending on which one it is, but they usually go upstream on the Salt River or some river, and they dump all of these ducks, literally out of a truck, I think. Dump all of these ducks into the water. And then they float down, and whichever ducks get to where the end mark is first, those ducks are pulled out, their numbers are written down, and they win all kinds of things. And the idea, of course, is, you know, it's random, of course, in a lot of ways, but you make your donation. And depending on the flow of the currents and other events and clogging up a piece of wood or whatever, a lot of ducks apparently don't even make it to the end of the thing. But it's a fairly random thing, as you might think. Well, a lot of times, and I think people in the world in general, our deployment is kind of like the Great Arizona Duck Race. We kind of say, well, yes, I want to be part of that. And our actual lives and experiences are kind of like rubber duckies floating down a river. You know, to where, whoa, kind of bumpy here, or bobbing on, like a cork bobbing on the water. And there's actually a lot of imagery in the New Testament, particularly Paul writing about, you know, things like being blown out by every wind of doctrine, and that's more wind than water. But all these kinds of things have kind of deployed, sent out there, and hope for the best, and know that God's going to guide you through all these hardships, sort of thing. And of course, God, I'm going to put it up here. God is going to guide us through all the hardships, but I wonder if we stop and think for a moment, if maybe many times the way we experience our life, and even our Christian life, is sort of like the Great Arizona Duck Race. You know, kind of, well, God's put us in the water. He's put me in my life as it is, kind of thing. And I'm bobbing up and down and encountering all kinds of obstacles and difficulties and that God needs to deliver me from. And He does in a sense. But is that really the kind of deployment that God ordains us to? And I would tend to say, no, it isn't. You know, that is the deployment of the world. Sometimes with the number written on us, so we say, I'm a Christian, I'm going to wear the label Christian, but I'm going to bob along just like everybody else, and maybe with a little bit better attitude. But kind of bob along, hopefully make it to the end, and trust that God's going to get through there, and if I can win a prize, that would be great. But mainly I'm just trying to survive the duck race, kind of thing. And I think there's a lot of that. And the world of flesh and devil, of course, reinforce that. At every turn, a contrasting model or imagery for deployment, of course, is the kind of deployment my son Jedediah, and a lot of you know, went through a Marine Corps boot camp. And he went through boot camp with the Marine Corps, and then, of course, was in the Marines. And that's definitely not a bobbing in the water kind of deployment. It's definitely not a dump them all in and hope they survive kind of thing. It is a very directed deployment. They come under authority immediately. One of the things when we were over at the Marine Corps, recruit people over there for the graduation and stuff, they give you a tour of everything. And one of the things all the kids were showing their parents and relatives and stuff right away is when we first arrived here on the bus, they get off the bus and there's painted on the ground footsteps, you know, and you line up on those footsteps. If you're not on those footsteps, you're in immediate trouble. And they all point in the same direction, and they organize them, and they tell you where you're supposed to be. Some of them are numbered footsteps. And that's where you're going to be. And you're going to be deployed into the training, which is extensive, as you might imagine. A couple of things I want us to imagine, holding that model and the reality sometimes of our lives is more like the duck race, but holding that model of deployment with a purpose and training with a purpose that God has for us, let's to hold that in mind. And then to take a step back and think for a moment in the context in which God deploys us isn't random, and it isn't just